The air in the small, sunlit living room felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of lavender polish and unspoken tension. Margaret Evans, 72, stood by the window, her gnarled fingers tracing the edge of a faded photograph in a silver frame. It was a picture of her late husband, George, and their son, Michael, from a time when laughter filled their home. She could still hear George's booming chuckle, the way he'd tease Michael about his messy hair. Those days seemed a lifetime ago now. Margaret had moved in with Michael and his wife, Laura, 6 months ago, after a fall left her unable to manage her old apartment alone. Michael had insisted, his warm brown eyes so much like his father's, promising she'd always have a home with them. Laura, however, had been less enthusiastic. Her smiles were tight, her words clipped, and Margaret felt the weight of her daughter-in-law's resentment with every passing day. This morning, Laura stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, her sharp features framed by sleek blonde hair. She was 35, confident, and carried herself with the air of someone who always got what she wanted. "Margaret," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet, "we need to talk about your rent." Margaret turned, her heart sinking. "Rent?" she asked softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. She'd never been asked to pay rent before. Michael had made it clear this was her home now. Laura's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes. Rent. You're living here, eating our food, using our utilities. It's only fair you contribute." Margaret's fingers tightened around the photo frame. She'd spent her life raising Michael, sacrificing her own dreams to ensure he had everything he needed. Her pension was modest, barely enough to cover her medications and small personal expenses. "Laura, I don't have much," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Laura stepped closer, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Then you'll pay rent by working as my maid," she said, her tone cold and final. "You can clean, cook, do the laundry. It's not much to ask, considering we're giving you a roof over your head." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. A maid, in her son's home. Her knees trembled, and she leaned against the windowsill for support. She wanted to protest, to remind Laura of the years she'd spent caring for this family. But the lump in her throat choked her words. She felt small, insignificant, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. Laura continued, oblivious to the pain in Margaret's eyes. "You can start today. The kitchen needs scrubbing, and the guest bathroom's a mess. I expect it done by dinner." She turned to leave, her heels echoing with authority, when the front door creaked open. Michael stepped inside, his briefcase in hand, his tie loosened from a long day at the office. He was early hours early, his brow furrowed as he caught the tail end of Laura's words. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low, his gaze shifting between his wife and his mother. Margaret's heart raced. She wanted to speak, to explain, but fear held her tongue. Laura froze, her confident demeanor faltering for a split second before she plastered on a smile. "Oh, Michael, you're home early. I was just discussing household chores with Margaret." Michael's eyes narrowed. He set his briefcase down and stepped closer, his broad shoulders tense. "Chores? Or rent?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a protective undertone that Margaret hadn't heard in years. Laura laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Rent? Oh, honey, I was joking. You know how I tease." But Michael wasn't smiling. He looked at Margaret, whose eyes were glistening with unshed tears, and something in his expression shifted. "Mom," He said softly. What did she say to you? Margaret hesitated, her loyalty to her son warring with the hurt Laura's words had inflicted. Finally, she whispered. She said I need to pay rent by working as her maid. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's jaw tightened, and he turned to Laura, his voice dangerously low. Is that true? Laura's face flushed, but she held her ground. Michael, you're overreacting. Someone has to keep this house in order. And I work all day. It's not unreasonable to ask her to help out. Help out. Michael's voice rose, a rare flash of anger breaking through his usual calm. She's my mother, Laura, not your servant. Margaret's heart ached as she watched her son confront his wife. She'd never wanted to be a burden, never wanted to drive a wedge between them. But Laura's words had cut deep, exposing a truth Margaret had been avoiding. She wasn't wanted here. Not by Laura. At least. I didn't mean it like that, Laura said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. I just thought. You thought you could humiliate my mother in her own home. Michael interrupted, his eyes blazing. This is her home, Laura. Hers as much as ours. Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek. She wanted to tell Michael to stop, to let it go, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she clutched the photo frame tighter, as if George's smiling face could anchor her through this storm. Michael took a deep breath, his anger giving way to resolve. We're going to figure this out, Mom, he said, turning to her. You're not a maid. You're family. Laura's face hardened, but she said nothing, her arms still crossed tightly. The tension in the room was palpable, a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. As Michael guided Margaret to the couch, promising to talk more later, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her place in this home wasn't as precarious as she'd feared. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Laura's resentment wouldn't vanish overnight, and Margaret wasn't sure how much fight she had left in her. That evening, the house was unnaturally quiet. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the chipped teacup she'd brought from her old apartment. It was one of the few things she'd kept, a relic from a life that felt increasingly distant. Michael had gone upstairs to talk to Laura, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. She couldn't shake the memory of Laura's words, the coldness in her tone. Being called a maid had stripped away the dignity Margaret had clung to all these years. She'd worked hard her entire life, first as a seamstress, then as a single mother after George's sudden heart attack when Michael was just 12. Every stitch she'd sewn, every late-night shift she'd taken, had been for her son. And now, to be reduced to this. The stairs creaked, and Michael appeared, his face drawn. He sat across from her, running a hand through his dark hair. Mom, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice heavy with guilt. I had no idea she felt that way. Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling as she touched his. It's not your fault, Michael. You've always been good to me. He shook his head, his jaw tight. I should have seen it. I've been so caught up with work. I didn't notice how she was treating you. Margaret wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was okay. But the truth was, it wasn't. Laura's words had exposed a rift in the family, one that Margaret feared might grow wider. What did she say? She asked, bracing herself. Michael sighed, leaning back in his chair. She says she's stressed. Work. The house. The bills, it's a lot. She claims she didn't mean it the way it sounded. But, he trailed off, his eyes searching hers. I don't know if I believe her. Margaret nodded, her heart heavy. She understood stress. the way it could twist even the kindest hearts. But Laura's words hadn't felt like a moment of frustration. They'd felt calculated. Cruel. What happens now? She asked quietly. Michael leaned forward, his voice firm. You're not going anywhere. Mom. This is your home. We'll figure out a way to make this work. But as the days passed, the tension in the house only grew. Laura became more distant. Her interactions with Margaret limited to curt nods and polite, empty phrases. Margaret tried to help around the house, washing dishes, folding laundry, not because she felt obligated, but because she wanted to ease the strain. Yet every task felt like a silent surrender to Laura's earlier demand. One afternoon, while Michael was at work, Margaret found herself alone with Laura in the living room. She was dusting the shelves, a task she'd taken on to keep busy, when Laura spoke up from the couch, her voice sharp. You missed a spot. Margaret froze, the cloth in her hand trembling. She turned to see Laura pointing at a shelf, her expression unreadable. I'm doing my best, Margaret said, her voice soft but firm. Laura raised an eyebrow. Your best? This house is still a mess. If you're going to stay here, you need to pull your weight. The words stung, but Margaret held her ground. I'm not your maid, Laura, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. I'm Michael's mother. Laura's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Carter, the neighbor, a kind woman in her 60s who often brought over homemade cookies. She stepped inside, her smile fading as she sensed the tension. Everything okay? She asked, her eyes flicking between Margaret and Laura. Fine, Laura said quickly, standing. Just a little misunderstanding. She excused herself, leaving Margaret and Mrs. Carter alone. Mrs. Carter placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. You look troubled, dear. Want to talk about it? Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. It's nothing, she lied, but the weight of her words felt like a betrayal of her own heart. She wanted to confide in someone, to share the hurt, but pride held her back. Instead, she offered Mrs. Carter a weak smile and changed the subject. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, she thought about her life before this house, before Laura's cold words. She remembered the small joys, gardening with George, teaching Michael to ride a bike, the pride she felt when he graduated college. Those memories were her strength, but they also reminded her of how much she'd lost. She didn't know how to fix this, how to bridge the gap between her and Laura. But she knew one thing. She wouldn't let herself be reduced to a servant in her son's home. She'd fought too hard, loved too deeply, to let her dignity be stripped away. The next morning, Margaret woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She couldn't change Laura's heart, but she could reclaim her own strength. She dressed carefully, choosing a pale blue cardigan that George had always loved, and made her way to the kitchen. She'd make breakfast for Michael, just like she used to when he was a boy, pancakes with a drizzle of maple syrup, his favorite. As the batter sizzled on the griddle, Michael appeared, his face softening at the familiar scent. Mom, you didn't have to do this, he said, but his smile betrayed his gratitude. I wanted to, Margaret replied, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. It's been a while since we had a proper breakfast together. They sat at the table, the morning light filtering through the curtains. And for a moment, it felt like the old days. Michael told her about a project at work, his voice animated, and Margaret listened, her heart swelling with pride. But the moment was fleeting. Laura entered, her expression cool as she poured herself coffee without a word. The silence was heavy, and Margaret felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. She wanted to say something, to bridge the divide. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she focused on her pancakes, cutting them into neat squares. After breakfast, Michael kissed her cheek and headed to work, promising to be home early. Laura lingered, her coffee mug in hand, watching Margaret clean up. "You don't have to do that. You know," she said, her tone neutral. Margaret paused, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I know," she said, "but I like to keep busy." Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. "Suit yourself." She left the kitchen, her heels clicking down the hall, and Margaret felt a pang of frustration. She wasn't doing this for Laura, she was doing it for herself. For Michael. For the home they were trying to hold together. Later that day, Margaret decided to take a walk. The neighborhood was quiet, the autumn leaves crunching under her feet. She passed Mrs. Carter's house and saw the older woman tending her garden. Mrs. Carter waved her over, her smile warm. "Join me for a bit?" she asked. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. They sat on a bench in the garden, surrounded by blooming chrysanthemums. Mrs. Carter didn't push, but her gentle presence made it easy for Margaret to open up. She told her about Laura's words, the hurt they'd caused, and the fear that she was losing her place in her son's life. Mrs. Carter listened, her eyes kind but sharp. "You're stronger than you realize, Margaret," she said. "You've raised a good man, and he loves you. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are." The words were a balm to Margaret's wounded heart. She thanked Mrs. Carter and returned home with a spark of determination. She wasn't just Michael's mother, she was Margaret Evans, a woman who'd faced loss and hardship and come out stronger. She wouldn't let Laura's cruelty define her. That evening, Michael came home with a surprise, a small bouquet of daisies. Margaret's favorite. "I thought you could use a little cheer," he said, handing them to her. Margaret's eyes misted as she took the flowers. "You didn't have to," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to," he replied, echoing her words from that morning. They shared a quiet moment, the flowers a reminder of the bond they'd always shared. But as Margaret arranged the daisies in a vase, she overheard Laura on the phone in the next room, her voice low but sharp. "She's not going anywhere. Apparently. Michael's made that clear. But I'm not running a charity here." Margaret's heart sank. She realized this wasn't just about rent or chores, it was about power, about Laura's need to control. And for the first time, Margaret wondered if staying in this house was worth the cost to her spirit. The days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house settled into a brittle routine. Margaret kept busy, tending to small tasks to avoid confrontation. But Laura's resentment was a constant undercurrent. Michael tried to mediate, but his efforts often left him caught between his mother and his wife, his face etched with exhaustion. One evening, Margaret found an old journal in a box of her belongings, its pages yellowed but filled with her handwriting. It was from the years after George's death, when she'd poured her grief and hopes into words. Reading it now, she felt a spark of her old self, the woman who'd faced loss with courage, who'd raised Michael alone, who'd never let hardship break her. She began writing again, late at night when the house was quiet. The words flowed, capturing her fears, her love for Michael, and her struggle to find her place in this fractured home. Writing became her refuge, a way to reclaim her voice. One morning, as she was writing at the kitchen table, Michael joined her, noticing the journal. "What's this, Mom?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Margaret hesitated, then slid the journal toward him. "Just some thoughts," she said. "Things I've been working through." Michael read a few pages, his expression softening. You're so strong, Mom, he said. I don't tell you that enough. His words warmed her, but they also reminded her of the growing distance between them. She wanted to tell him about Laura's phone call, about the resentment that simmered beneath the surface, but she didn't want to burden him further. Instead, she decided to take action. She reached out to a local community center she'd heard about from Mrs. Carter, one that offered classes and activities for seniors. The idea of stepping out of the house, of finding a space where she wasn't defined by Laura's expectations, was both daunting and exhilarating. Her first visit to the center was a revelation. The room was filled with people her age, their faces lit with laughter and purpose. She joined a knitting group, her fingers remembering the rhythm of the needles from her days as a seamstress. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again, not a burden, not a maid, but Margaret. When she returned home, her heart was lighter, but the atmosphere in the house hadn't changed. Laura was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, and barely acknowledged Margaret's arrival. Michael was still at work, and the silence between the two women was heavy. That evening, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't keep living like this, tiptoeing around Laura's resentment. She needed to talk to Michael, to lay everything bare. She waited until he came home, then asked him to sit with her in the kitchen. Michael, she began, her voice steady. I love you, and I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. But I can't stay here if Laura sees me as a burden. Michael's face fell. Mom, you're not a burden. I've told her that. I know you have, Margaret said, her eyes glistening. But she doesn't feel the same. I heard her on the phone, saying she's not running a charity. I can't live where I'm not wanted. Michael's expression darkened, a mix of anger and sorrow. She said that? He asked, his voice low. Margaret nodded, her heart aching. She didn't want to hurt him, but she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I think it's time I looked for somewhere else to live, she said, the words heavy but necessary. Michael reached for her hand, his grip firm. No, Mom. This is your home. If anyone's leaving, it's not you. Michael's words lingered in the air, a promise that both comforted and unsettled Margaret. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he could mend the fracture in their family. But doubt gnawed at her. Laura's resentment wasn't something that could be fixed with a single conversation, and Margaret feared the cost of staying in a home where she felt like an outsider. The next day, she returned to the community center, finding solace in the knitting group. The women there welcomed her with open arms, sharing stories of their own struggles and triumphs. One woman, Clara, a sprightly 80-year-old with a sharp wit, became a fast friend. Clara had lost her husband years ago and had faced her own battles with family dynamics. You can't let someone else define your worth, Margaret, she said, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. You're more than what they see. Inspired by Clara's words, Margaret began to explore her options. She didn't want to leave Michael's home, but she needed a plan, a way to reclaim her independence. She met with a counselor at the center, who told her about subsidized housing for seniors and part-time work opportunities. The idea of starting over at 72 was daunting, but it also sparked a flicker of excitement. She wasn't ready to give up on herself. At home, the tension between Laura and Margaret grew colder. Laura stopped speaking to her altogether, communicating through pointed glances and terse notes left on the counter. Clean the fridge, one read. Vacuum the upstairs, said another. Margaret ignored them, focusing instead on her time at the community center and her journal, where she poured out her hopes and fears. Michael noticed the change in his mother. One evening, as they sat on the porch, he asked, You seem different, Mom. Happier. Maybe. Margaret smiled. The first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. I've been spending time at the community center, she said. It's good to feel useful again. Michael's face lit up. That's great, Mom. I want you to be happy. But his smile faded as he glanced toward the house, where Laura was inside. I'm still working on things with Laura. I don't want you to feel like you have to leave. Margaret touched his arm, her heart heavy but resolute. I know you're trying, Michael, but I need to do what's right for me, too. The next day, Margaret met with the counselor again, who helped her fill out applications for senior housing. It was a small step, but it felt like a giant leap toward reclaiming her life. She didn't tell Michael, yet she wanted to be sure before she broke the news. That evening, as Margaret was knitting in her room, Laura knocked on the door, an unusual gesture. Can we talk? She asked, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. Margaret nodded, bracing herself. Laura sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly. I know things have been tense, she began. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Margaret waited, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe Laura's words, but trust was hard to come by after everything that had happened. I was wrong to say what I did, Laura continued, her eyes fixed on the floor. I was stressed, and I took it out on you. I'm sorry. The apology caught Margaret off guard. She searched Laura's face for sincerity, but the younger woman's expression was guarded, her body tense. Thank you for saying that, Margaret said carefully. But words don't erase the hurt. Laura nodded, her lips tight. I know. I want to make this work. Margaret wanted to believe her, but the weight of Laura's earlier actions lingered. She thanked her for the apology and excused herself, needing time to process. As she closed the door, she felt a mix of hope and caution. Could Laura change? Or was this just another way to keep the peace? Laura's apology lingered in Margaret's mind, but it didn't erase the months of tension. She wanted to trust that Laura meant it, that they could find a way to coexist. But doubt kept her guarded. She continued her routine at the community center, finding strength in the friendships she was building and the sense of purpose it gave her. One afternoon, Clara invited Margaret to a book club at the center, where they discussed a novel about family and forgiveness. The story resonated deeply with Margaret, stirring memories of her own struggles with George's family after his death. His mother had never approved of her, and the years of navigating that disapproval had taught Margaret resilience. Now, she saw parallels with Laura, but she also saw a chance to break the cycle. She decided to try talking to Laura again, this time on her own terms. One evening, when Michael was working late, Margaret found Laura in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. Can I help? Margaret asked, her voice gentle but firm. Laura looked up, surprised. Sure, she said, handing Margaret a knife and a cutting board. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of chopping filling the space between them. Finally, Margaret spoke. Laura, I appreciate your apology, but I need to know we can move forward without resentment. I want this to be a home for all of us. Laura paused, her knife hovering over a carrot. I want that too, she said, her voice softer than usual. I've been under a lot of pressure, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. Margaret nodded, sensing a crack in Laura's armor. We all have our burdens, she said, but we don't have to carry them alone. The conversation wasn't a cure-all, but it was a start. Over the next few days, Laura made small efforts offering Margaret a cup of tea, asking about her day at the community center. Margaret responded in kind, careful not to push too hard but open to rebuilding trust. Meanwhile, Margaret's application for senior housing was approved. The counselor called to tell her about a small apartment in a nearby complex, affordable and close to the community center. The news filled Margaret with both relief and uncertainty. She hadn't wanted to leave Michael's home, but the idea of her own space, where she could be herself without fear, was tempting. She told Michael about the apartment over dinner, choosing her words carefully. "It's not that I want to leave you," she said, her eyes meeting his, "but I need to feel like I belong somewhere." Michael's face fell, but he nodded. "I understand, Mom. I just wish things were different." Laura, who was sitting across the table, looked down at her plate, her expression unreadable. Margaret wondered what she was thinking, whether she felt relief or guilt. But she didn't ask. She was done trying to read Laura's mind. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, she thought about the apartment, the community center, and the life she was starting to rebuild. She wasn't the same woman who'd moved into this house 6 months ago, frail and uncertain. She'd found her strength again, and no one, not even Laura, could take that away. The decision to move weighed heavily on Margaret, but it also felt like a liberation. She spent the next week preparing, packing her belongings, and visiting the apartment to plan how she'd make it her own. The space was small but cozy, with a window overlooking a garden that reminded her of the one she'd tended with George. She could already imagine herself there, knitting, writing, living on her own terms. Michael helped her with the logistics, his support unwavering despite the sadness in his eyes. "I'm going to miss having you here, Mom," he said as they sorted through her boxes. "I'll still be close," Margaret reassured him, though her heart ached at the thought of leaving him. "You can visit anytime." Laura, to her credit, didn't interfere. She kept her distance, offering polite words but no real warmth. Margaret didn't push. Learned that trust had to be earned, not demanded. At the community center, Margaret shared her plans with Clara and the others, who threw her a small going-away party. They gave her a handmade quilt, each square stitched with love and care. "This is for your new home," Clara said, her eyes shining. "A reminder that you're never alone." The gesture brought tears to Margaret's eyes. She'd spent so long feeling like a burden. But here, among these women, she felt seen, valued, loved. It was a gift she hadn't expected, one that gave her the courage to take the next step. On moving day, Michael drove her to the apartment, helping her carry boxes and set up her furniture. Laura stayed behind, citing a work commitment. But Margaret didn't mind. This was her moment, her chance to reclaim her life. As they unpacked, Michael found the old journal Margaret had been writing in. "You should keep this up, Mom," he said, flipping through the pages. "You've got a story worth telling." Margaret smiled, taking the journal from him. "Maybe I will," she said. She'd been thinking about sharing her writing with the book club, maybe even turning it into something more. The idea scared her, but it also thrilled her. That evening, after Michael left, Margaret sat in her new apartment, the quilt draped over her lap. The silence was different here, peaceful, not oppressive. She opened her journal and began to write, the words flowing like a river. She wrote about George, about Michael, about the pain of Laura's words and the strength she'd found in herself. As she wrote, she realized that this wasn't the end of her story. It was a new chapter. She'd faced loss before, and she'd face it again, but she'd do it with her head held high. Months later, Margaret's apartment had become a home. She'd decorated it with small touches, daisies in a vase, photos of Michael and George on the walls, the quilt from her friends at the community center. She spent her days at the center, teaching a knitting class and sharing her writing with the book club. Her journal had grown into a collection of essays, stories of her life that resonated with others. Clara called her a hidden gem, and the words filled Margaret with pride. Michael visited often, bringing coffee or takeout, and their bond grew stronger than ever. He'd separated from Laura, a decision that had been painful but necessary. "I couldn't stay with someone who hurt you like that," he told Margaret one evening, his voice heavy but resolute. Margaret didn't rejoice in their separation. She knew love was complicated, and she'd seen the good in Laura, however fleeting. But she was grateful for Michael's loyalty, for the way he'd chosen to protect her. One day, Laura showed up at Margaret's apartment, unannounced. She stood in the doorway, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Can we talk?" she asked. Margaret invited her in, offering tea. They sat at the small kitchen table, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. "I've been thinking a lot," Laura began, her voice low. "About what I said, how I treated you. I was wrong, Margaret. I let my stress turn me into someone I'm not proud of." Margaret listened, her heart open but cautious. "I appreciate that, Laura," she said. "But it's not just about words. It's about respect." Laura nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know. I'm trying to be better. Michael and I, we're working on things. But I wanted to apologize to you first." Margaret saw the sincerity in Laura's eyes, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," she said. "I hope we can find a way forward." They talked for a while, not as enemies, but as two people trying to understand each other. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step. When Laura left, Margaret felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. That night, Margaret wrote in her journal, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She'd been called a maid, a burden, but she'd proven she was neither. She was Margaret Evans, a woman who'd faced pain and found her strength, who'd built a new life from the ashes of the old. As she closed the journal, she looked around her apartment, at the life she'd created. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And that was enough.